Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Brady and today I have Brandon Grant on the channel again, and we're going to be talking about Imperial Knights. So let's get into that discussion then, and let's talk about how we feel about Knights and their current state in the meta and why they're so popular. So Brandon, I guess I'll let you start on that.
Certainly. So a little history there. Knights were very popular last year, and even up to LVO, extremely powerful. Probably the best primary or secondary army in the game for an Imperial list. But after the latest balance that occurred in March or April of this year, Knights have really been brought back into line a lot more. So the two major changes were that the Knight Castellan added 100 points to its cost, and the Rotate Ion Shield stratagem cannot take a Knight beyond a 4++. So those two changes combined meant that it was much more difficult for someone to bring a Castellan that would be extremely points efficient at removing the enemy army and have it survive an entire round of shooting and be able to use a command point to make it fight as if it was at full health for another turn. So you'd get 2 to 3 rounds of amazing shooting out of this Knight, which is usually enough so that the heavy hitting stuff in your opponent's army is gone. So that sort of playstyle for an Imperial Knights related army it's not completely gone. I've seen Castellan's post nerf, but it's a lot less good than it was. And I'm celebrating this because, especially for Knight players, we're seeing stuff show up that is far more creative and far more fun to play against and far more balanced, but still very strong. And to be clear, when we talk about Knight lists, even after the ITC has changed the way factions are tracked, it makes a lot more sense to think of Knights as primarily points in Knights plus some allies, because Knights are limited in how they can move around the board. They struggle with magic boxes or terrain pieces that they can't go inside of, so that one scout squad or a squad of Nurglings on an objective, the Knights can't attack it because they can't charge it because it's out of line of sight. They can't shoot it. That's a problem. But having some allies who can go into buildings or shoot into buildings with indirect fire, that's really the Knight list that we're talking about. And there's a couple of archetypes that I think are really powerful. One of them is you just throw a Knight Crusader into an army with the Crast house, and you take the relic that gives every single unsaved wound that goes through from this weapon an additional damage against vehicles and an additional 2 damage against vehicles with the Titanic keyword, or basically anything with 10 or more wounds is going to take a lot more damage from this Knight. And when you have a Gatling cannon and a battle cannon and or thermal lance plus a carapace weapon, that's a lot of hits that can really add up very quickly. So this Knight becomes relatively efficient at simply removing mid-range or tough things from the enemy army.
That's called the Headsman's Mark, by the way. That's the name of the
Yes, that's the one. So that's just kind of a plug-and-play way to throw a single Imperial Knight into an Imperial list. I haven't seen it much personally. On paper, it looks pretty strong to me, especially if you have something allied with it, like, say, Deathwatch Marines, that can push very strongly in the middle of the board, so enemies can't get close enough to the Crusader to really start doing serious damage to it. But it's not the thing that I'm really worried about. The thing I'm worried more about, and the thing we should discuss today, is what do you do against a Knight's primary army? Because if we're discussing the Crast Crusader list with just one Crusader, that's an army with a Knight ally. That's primarily something else. But I have seen, for example, double or triple Crast Crusaders in a detachment with predominantly guard allies, or different Mechanicus houses, because Mechanicus gets the 1 command point fight at full health, or even House Hawkshroud, which, speaking from personal experience, was my only loss at the Bay Area Open was to a House Hawkshroud primary player named Junior from San Diego. And
was he the guy using the Valiant?
Yes, actually.
Okay.
So something to be aware of with Knights that are Hawkshroud, they count as double the number of wounds remaining for what level they fight in. So they're almost as good as the Mechanicus, but they don't need to use command points when they take damage, which is quite nice. The knights keep fighting almost at full strength. Combined with their special stratagem, which is for 2 command points, if you charge an Imperial unit that is within 12 inches of a Hawkshroud Knight, that Hawkshroud Knight gets to overwatch you, and then move 2d6 inches closer to the unit that completed a charge against that unit, even if they don't get into melee. And that was the specific combination that really got me into trouble. Specifically in our game, there were a couple things that happened. One, he ended up giving his Gallant. Oh, I should actually just go over his list before I really discuss it. So his list from memory was a Crusader, a Gallant, and a Valiant, and then 2 battalions of Cadians with 2 Wyverns and miscellaneous mortars sprinkled everywhere in the list, plus 2 Primaris Psykers, 2 company commanders. So a pretty ordinary looking list, but the way it works on paper is the Cadians can hold his deployment zone. If the Cadians are getting charged by an army that's melee aggressive, he can have his knights, especially the Valiant, behind his front lines, heroically intervene 2d6 inches into you, possibly getting into melee without being able to be swung back into, and also overwatch you with the relic flamethrower that the Valiant can take. So it's a pretty brutal list to go into with melee units, and it can be very aggressive because it has the 3 knights that can all move forward and can all be very tough. And the way you do it is you can do something like give the Gallant a 2-up armor or a 5+ invul and melee relic. You can give the Valiant the 4-up always, and then the Crusader, you can just use rotate ion shields for 1 command point. It's not a big deal when you have 2 battalions of Cadians plus 6 command points from having 3 big knights. So the list is reasonably tough, hits very hard, and has the right tools to deal with the weaknesses of knights. Weaknesses of knights are hordes and buildings that knights can't move into or shoot into. So the big thing that swung the game in our case was his Gallant took the Warlord trait of +2 to advances and rolled a 6 for his advance move turn 1, and then rolled nicely for his charge move. So he was actually able to charge me from his deployment zone turn 1. From I
that's
think
with the use of a
30.
Stratagem, by the way. Knights can't normally advance.
Yeah, he has to use a stratagem to do that full tilt.
Yep.
But 1 knight can do that every turn, and putting it on the Gallant is pretty solid choice. So that was my mistake, is being close enough that some high rolls would get him in. Number 1. Number 2, he charged just enough to keep the back of his Gallant, because they're very large oval bases, within barely 12 inches of the Valiant, which, looking at the board, was difficult for me to discern. It didn't seem like it was within 12, but it was. And failing to plan for that, the Valiant moved, I think, 8 inches closer to me, and on turn 2, the Harpoon was in range of my tanks when it wouldn't have been in range normally until turn 3, the way I'd deployed. So that ended up deciding the game from that.
So he can
the
use that
takeaway
as like
for
a
me,
leapfrog method to get his Valiant up closer to be able to start using that Harpoon quicker. That's actually a very good strategy.
It is. And I'd calculated a lot of this stuff ahead of time, and I'd put old grudges on the Valiant and assumed that I would get it down to 1 or 2 wounds or possibly dead because of my list having an Earthshaker that I double shot with rerolls to hit, 3 tank commanders with battle cannons, plasma cannons, all in range, the relic battle cannon, and all with rerolls 1s to hits on the Layman Russ. Everything rerolling to wound, except the Basilisk, which was out of range. But it's strength 9, it wounds on 3s. After everything was said and done, it still had 14 wounds remaining after my shooting phase. So that was unexpected. But anyway, I have to give Junior a lot of props because he played his list really well, and I really actually like the way the list functions. The Knights support the Cadians support the Knights. So if you're against an army that has Deep Strike reserves, for example, you can screen with the Cadians and keep the Knights behind them. And if you're playing a list that's really shooty, you can put the Knights forward and use the Cadians to hold your deployment zone and or shoot and clear screens so that your Knights will be able to properly hit the things that they need to, like the Gallant going into, say, Chimeras instead of infantry squads. I feel like this list is exactly where Knights should have been last year. It has a lot of strengths. It has some serious weaknesses that are being covered in the use of allies. And it's a really fun list to play, and it's very thematic to have the house really impact the game that way and the way the game's played. So now that we know roughly how these knights lists are working in terms of you want to have lots of command points so you can give your knights lots of relics and warlord traits, because if you have a 300 to 500 point model and you're giving it +1 to its saving throw, that's a huge benefit, because you're taking 25% of your list and you're making some percent better. That's really good. So you want to really upgrade your knights so that they're as strong as you can possibly make them. So having lots of command points makes them really good. Having allies who can go into buildings, allies who can screen for them. Really like guard plus knights. It's just
and like
bread
you
and butter
mentioned
stuff.
in the last video too, it almost seems like it was Games Workshop's design philosophy that you should play knights with stuff like Astra Militarum and stuff like that, because some of their big weaknesses is like you were saying, they can't go inside buildings. There's certain parts of the board that like your opponent can basically play like keep away, just running around a terrain piece, and it'll be hard for the knight to ever get around and get to it.
Yep.
They can't deal with stuff hiding inside of the terrain because they can't go in there. And then what I kind of found from trying to play a pure knights list, that if you're up against something like Smash Captains with Blood Angel Smash Captains with good rolls, they can actually one-shot a knight, like if they get their decent rolls. And so when I was playing against my buddy that is a Blood Angel player, and I was playing pure knights, I noticed that I was having to screen my knights with other knights, and so either way, he killed the knight. So you need those infantry in there to create that area, that the deep strike denial, to stop them from getting to your good targets. Knights by themselves really aren't. They have a lot of inherent flaws that can be abused by a lot of armies, but that's why they have to be played in an Imperial Soup style list. So personally, I don't think we'd ever see like a pure knight list get top at an event because of things like that. But Imperial Soup, they work amazing in, because they just synergize so well with like Astra Militarum, with artillery and stuff that can shoot inside of buildings that knights can't go to, with infantry that you don't mind losing to deep striking Smash Captains and stuff like that. So yeah, I think they work really well as Imperial, not so good on their own. They're still very strong though, and like I was saying earlier, they're one of the more popular armies. So I kind of feel like this is the case too, because knights are, I don't want to say easy to play, but they're kind of easy to play. Like they're still hard to play at a top level, like every army is. When two good players are playing against each other, it's not necessarily an easy game unless one person is rolling like nothing but ones and the other one's rolling nothing but sixes. But knights, like when I say easy, I mean in the way like when I was playing my knight armies or my knight army, my turns went by in 10 minutes. I had way more time to think about where am I going to put this guy so that he doesn't get charged and that I can do what I want on the next turn. Whereas if you're playing like an orc army, you have zero time to think. You're moving models instantly to try to get through your turn, especially if you have a chess clock on you. With knights, each model just, it's almost like a mini army itself. So it's just kind of easier for you to think about what you're doing and stuff like that, just because there's a lot less you have to worry about in a way. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, and I'd say that I get the same sensation as an orc player when I'm moving my 90 catechins up the board with 2 movement phases thanks to movement move. It's easy for a numerous army to run out of time, especially if you actually do need to think through the game very carefully, just because it is a resource that you're using up every time you move a model. And if your army simply has 3 huge models that are 3/4 of your army, that really simplifies a lot of your decision making.
Yep, and it gives you more time too, because your movement phase, like you can spend, like say if each player is going to spend 15 minutes a turn based on a chess clock to try to get through like the whole game or whatever, and then obviously the later turns would be quicker and whatnot, but an orc player has to spend most of that time moving their models and then fixing up their dice app to be able to get all the appropriate amount of shots and everything else. Whereas with a knight player, you could literally stand there and think for 10 minutes, what am I going to do? And then for the last 5 minutes, you can move your whole army and like shoot all your guns, and that would be it. Like you could do it insanely quick. So that's why I'm saying, in a way, personally, I feel like it's an easier army to play because it's way less restrictive in how much time that you can have to actually think about your plays and make good plays, instead of like an orc player or horde player who I would assume makes way more mistakes because they're rushing through everything to stay on time.
That's right. It's a lot more approachable compared to a horde army.
That, and I also think another reason it's so popular too is because at least at one point it was a fairly cheap army to build. I got like the 2 knights you can probably see in the background. I bought those when they had that box set, the Renegade box. It was like $200 and you get 2 knights with it. So it was basically buy a knight, get a knight free at that point. And I think a lot of people ended up doing that when that box was out. And you do that, and then you go out and you spend another few hundred dollars on Astra Militarum stuff. You got yourself a really cheap but still fairly competitive army to play with.
That's right.
Compared to something like orcs, where you're spending $1,000-something because of all the boys and everything else you got to add together.
On top of that, it's an army that is going to be well supported for some time, and you're always going to be able to trade models with other players simply because it's such a common army. There's always someone who's having a garage sale with knights or guard or both. So it's a relatively approachable army in that sense as well.
So for popularity wise, I think those are 2 of the things that go into it, but also we can't deny that the army is still fairly strong. A lot of armies have a hard time killing knights because they're all like multiple wounds, 24 unless you take one of the big boys, and it's 28. They can have their 4-up invols. And from my experience with playing the army, the knights really only die if you can get something in close combat with them that hits like a truck. Because shooting,
that's a good summary.
Yeah, because in shooting, like they can still die to shooting, but if you get lucky and roll 1,000,000 4-up invols, then you're fine. And then even if they go down to 12 wounds or whatever from shooting, then you can still use the stratagem to make them shoot at full bracket. So the easiest way, at least from what I've seen, the only way my knights die, or the only way they become useless, is if they get like one shot by like Magnus or something like that actually gets into close combat with them.
I would agree. Knights are built very much to be more resilient against shooting than they are against melee. The Ion Shield rule does not work in melee, and you have to take a relic if you want it to. So the game's also balanced in the sense that there's a lot of threats in the game that hit so hard in melee that just about anything they touch, including an Imperial Knight, will dissolve. And even if you have your 4-up Invul Knight engaged in combat, it's very likely to be close to dead against some of these units. And the units I think of are things like Mortarion, if you're running the Loyalist Imperial Knights. Magnus is a good option. The Khorne Demon Prince with the Relic Axe that does bonus damage to Titanic.
Skull Reaver Axe, yeah.
Skull Reaver Axe, that's the one. So Chaos has plenty of tools to just walk up to a knight and smash it. Like you mentioned, Blood Angel Captains, if you buff them up with extra attacks, and you give them even the Relic Thunderhammer that doesn't take a bonus or a penalty to hit, you can definitely have a Smash Captain who swings twice, and then a third time when he dies, take down an Imperial Knight very easily. And sometimes not die in return if he's got a Storm Shield. He just makes enough 3-up saves.
Yeah, that's the thing with invols too. If you're rolling hot, then it just seems like you're undamageable, essentially.
Especially if he swings first, which he will, and reduces you to your bottom tier, so you're only hitting on 5s or 6s, depending on the class of knight you're using. He can easily live. And heck, even Genestealer Cult. You look at an Acolyte unit with 4 Rock Saws, and they give you enough buffs so they're wounding on 2s with the formation. Yeah, that is a lot of damage that your knight is not going to be able to handle at AP 4. So if you don't have an invul, goodbye. Or if you do take the invul, they throw the Aberrant unit, where if they have enough buffs, just the 2 hypermorph characters can oftentimes be enough to cripple your knight by themselves because of the number of attacks at strength 14 that they're putting out. So there are definitely units in the game, if you are a knight player, where if you don't have the screen, your knight will die. There is no way around it. So I feel like if you're playing against knights and you're playing one of those armies that does have melee units that hit so hard. Even as a Chaos player, the Lord Discordant now, because he even gets bonuses against vehicles. You have great options against knights as long as you can remove their screens and get to them. You'll be able to remove them. But on the other hand, if you don't have access to those tools, knights can be a very difficult matchup, and they can definitely be a spoiler matchup for a lot of different lists. So if you're running an orcish horde without a lot of power claws, and you run up against a gallant with a 2-up armor save, and maybe it's House Raven, so it ignores AP 1, that single knight can go through 80% of your army before you're able to stop it. So you're going to need to build your list in competitive play to know that knights exist in the meta, to know that there might not be very many infantry when you're facing knights, and still be able to do enough damage or at least play enough on the board to score points and continue to play the game. Because that's the effect that I like from knights. Knights can definitely skew very hard in terms of what you need to prepare for in order to deal with them. So I like the effect they have on the meta, so that you don't just have a 300 conscript army taking over everyone, because you need to be able to plan for the 300 conscript army, and you need to be able to plan for the 5 knight army and everything in between. And if you don't have the right mix of offense on your tools, or at least some way to deal with the 5 knights, it's very easy to keep them use that list as a gatekeeper that just stops an otherwise very solid list.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've been saying that for a while, actually, ever since knights made their way into the meta. I actually think knights are healthy for the game, because if it wasn't for knights being part of the game, I feel like the thing to do and what the meta would have turned into is just hordes and hordes and hordes and tons of anti-infantry shots. And just tons of bodies that can just camp objectives and all that kind of stuff. But with knights, like how you were saying, you do need to plan for knights as well, and you can't just take a million bolters or a million anti-infantry, because then the knights are just going to run through your entire army. So you have to find this good mix of being able to deal with stuff like orcs and with 300 conscripts, even though I haven't seen that, but I'm sure there's someone out there playing that list. And other horde armies. You still need a good balance between both. So getting into that, then, how would you build a list? How would you build a list for? And you can go based off of Astra Militarum if you want, because I know that's your primary army that you play with. How would you build a list to combat the knight meta, but also while still being relevant against other like horde armies, like orcs and stuff like that?
So the way you stay relevant against knights, if the way you deal with them is shooting, is you try and control enough of the midfield so that the knights can't threaten your shooting well enough to deal with it. Because, like you said, knights are very efficient at absorbing shooting when they're using 4-up invuls, and they're toughness 8, and they have a lot of wounds. So if you are relying on shooting to deal with knights, you need time. It's going to take time for your shooting to grind through the knights so that you can finally push through the knights and start getting into the backfield. But in order to give yourself time, as a guard player, the way you get time is with bodies. So knights can fall back from combat through non-vehicle, non-monster over infantry. So if you're trying to block them by charging them and then having your couple of surviving infantry models block them from falling back, that doesn't work. But if you move infantry just outside of heroic intervention range, they won't be able to heroically intervene. In their movement phase, they won't be able to move through you. And the infantry that you move forward will absolutely get stomped on by the knight. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. But you will have gained 9 to 12 inches of movement that knight would have had to get closer to your shooting assets and start damaging them. So if you can build a list that uses shooting to get rid of knights and give yourself enough time so that the shooting can get its work in, then you stand a chance against knights. Because the other thing is most knights only have about 36 inches max for their weapons. So if you can stay outside of 36, or at least out of charge range, it's much harder for them to efficiently remove you now that the Castellan is a 704 point investment. Previously, it would have been The Castellan just kills you, and it's tall, and you can't hide from it because it's so tall, so all your vehicles are going to die. Thankfully, that's less of a concern because it can't be a 3-up invul every turn, and it can conceivably die if they go second. That's the plan if you're doing it with shooting. If you're doing it with melee, you'll actually want a different plan. The plan you'll want is whatever the knights are using to prevent you from throwing your Smash Captain or your Rock Saws or your Mortarion into the knight, you need to remove it quickly. So you might take anti-infantry indirect shooting. So if you were a Space Marine player, a Thunderfire Cannon or a Wyvern. So even if those infantry are blocking your reserves by being out of line of sight, you can get rid of them. Or alternatively, you have other reserves that are just there to get rid of the infantry cheaply. I'm looking at Flamer Acolytes, for example, where they just show up. This one unit removes as much screen as possible. And yes, it's going to die horribly when knights stomp all over it. But on the following turn, there's not enough bodies. And then your anti-tank can finally get into the knights and start removing them. And once 1 or 2 knights go down, it can be very snowball in your favor because they start losing options very quickly. So that's the other side of the coin is, yes, you have these very tough models that can take a lot of abuse before they start degrading. But once they're gone, your list very quickly loses effectiveness. So those would be the 2 approaches is if you have melee, get rid of their screen so that you can push into them. If you have shooting, use your own screen so that they can't push into you so you have enough time to shoot them to death.
Makes a lot of sense. How would you do that with like we were talking about the Crusader and like the Headsman's Mark and stuff like that? How do you think that strategy would fare on like Dawn of War deployment where they don't have that much space between you and them?
Well, at that point, you're going to want secondary options. So any good shooting list, you're still going to want to have some melee anti-tank. And alternatively, if you're making a melee anti-tank list, it's nice to have some anti-tank shooting to support yourself. So for example, if you're looking at a unit that's expecting to do about 20 wounds to a knight, it's nice to have enough shooting in your list to do about 8 to 12 wounds to a knight on average, so that before you charge in, the knight's low enough that you'll just smack it before it can swing back at you.
Yep.
That's the goal anyway. So in a guard list, I'll do things like take a maximum squad of Bulgrins and take the Old Grudge's Warlord trait. So if my shooting starts dying early, I can start pushing with my list, and the knight that's giving me the most trouble, I can put Old Grudges on it. And then even though I'm strength 7 with the Bulgrins, rerollable 5s to wound with 2 damage attacks actually can chew through an Imperial Knight in melee. It's not very efficient. It's not my first choice, but at least I have options.
Have you considered trying to add like Smash Captains to your list?
I have actually. One of the list concepts that I had was a Blood Angels Smash Captain, a Blood Angels Librarian Dreadnought, and 3 squads of Primaris Intercessors in a battalion. And partially that was to deal with the perceived threat of an Eldar Flyer meta because minus to hit doesn't work in melee.
Yep.
And both of those choices for HQ can smack an Eldar Flyer pretty handily, especially the Librarian Dreadnought.
Yeah, I was just about to say for people that don't know, the Librarian Dreadnought, the reason it can charge the flyer is because of, I believe it's called Wings of Sanguinius. It's a spell that can cast on himself to give him the fly keyword. And beforehand, you give him the Quickening, which I believe gives him plus 3 inches to his charge and also D3 extra attacks when he charges. And then you can do something like the Red Rampage, which is another plus D3 extra attacks. So you can have your Librarian Dreadnought running into battle, or flying into battle, I should say, with plus 3 on the charge with an extra 2d3 extra attacks. It's kind of nutty.
Yeah. So Librarian Dreadnought can definitely do some damage to a knight that doesn't have an invul, because his attacks are also AP4, and he wounds knights on 3s.
Because of Red Thirst.
He is a character, so you can swing twice with him, or you can swing when he dies. So yes, you can trade a Blood Angels Librarian Dreadnought with the right dice rolls for an Imperial Knight.
Actually,
and I'll take that trade any day.
Wouldn't it wound against a knight on 2s because of Red Thirst?
Oh yeah, with Red Thirst, 2s to wound.
It would be 2s to wound. and then flat 3 damage each, and yeah, choose through big targets like that.
Yep.
Yeah, the
especially if he's somehow within 6 inches of a captain, so he's rerolling his ones to hit.
Yep, that too.
Pretty solid.
Yeah, very, very good choice for Blood Angels players out there, especially with the flyer meta too. Which, speaking of which, you were saying earlier about weaknesses for knights. You didn't mention the flyer meta. Why is that?
First of all, knights can actually shoot flyers reasonably well with the right build. They have move 12 base, so they can move pretty far. And then their guns can be up to 36-inch range. And flyers are reasonable at move blocking knights for melee, but that still means the flyers are going to be close. And if flyers that are Eldar get within 12 inches of a knight, they're only at -1 to be hit. And knights have 3s normally to shoot you. So they're actually not terrible against just a -1.
Okay.
So I don't think knights are the worst thing ever into Eldar flyers, but Eldar Alatok flyers in particular for the -2, just because of the move plus the BS3+. If they were BS4+, oh yeah, -1 and -2 when you're hitting on 5s or 6s, you hardly do any damage anymore. So that would be a serious problem. But yeah, even like the Crast Crusader, with the 4+ invul shooting from 36 inches away, you can definitely do a lot of damage to an enemy flyer. You can even split fire and hope you shoot down 2 of them.
Yeah, I was just about to say you can kill 2 a turn if you get a little lucky.
It's definitely a very solid way to get rid of Eldar flyers. But in any case, there's always that question of, well, what's in the rest of the list? Because if the support can do things like remove the support for the flyers from objectives, suddenly the flyer player is having a lot of trouble scoring objectives, and the knight player can start scoring more every turn.
Yeah, that's how you won your game at the LVO, if I remember correctly.
Yes, I scored more every turn and got a bonus point every turn for holding my bonus objectives.
And that's how with me, I currently, my tournament list is Drukhari, but I'm actually thinking about changing it up. But I now play mainly Drukhari, like a pure Drukhari list, ever since they nerfed Doom and Jinx. Rest in peace. But yeah, so because of that, it's pure Drukhari now. And the way I've been beating knights, and it's hit or miss, but this is the way that I have to do it, because all of the anti-tank in my list, and we've already been over that shooting in the first place isn't the best way to deal with knights. It's all right, but with their 4-up invols and whatnot, it can be pretty hard. All of my anti-tank are like blasters and my disintegrator cannons. So the blasters are strength 8, and then they get their, so I only wound on a 4-up, which I have to hit on a 3 in the first place. And then with the disintegrator cannons, they're only strength 5, so they wound on 5s. With Doom back in the day, this was amazing, but now without re-rolling all of your failed wounds, it's kind of hard to put that DACA in there to actually get them down. So the way I've been playing against knights with my list is I went back to my old style where I bring more venoms and more troops. And the reason is I hope that I go second, believe it or not, and I just win by every turn. I go, okay, they're on this many objectives. Well, I'm going to take all my venoms and fly onto objectives if I need to hold more than them. And sometimes I'll just get a unit of witches or something just to go try to steal an objective from the knight. Sometimes this is hard to do though, because a lot of the knights are characters. So if they put their guy close enough, like in the, like right on top of the objective, sometimes it's hard to do this because they just heroically intervene to you and then kick you in the face. But that's why I said it's kind of hit or miss, but that's how I've been trying to deal with it. But because, like I said, it's hit or miss and isn't working as good as I would hope it would work, I'm starting to think about actually picking up a different army just to deal with knights.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I'm glad you brought that up. It's my opinion that Drukhari are one of the factions that will struggle the most with knights because of how their faction is built. For example, grotesques are what they rely on to be super tough and move up the middle. But knights don't care about grotesques. Grotesques don't do anything to knights. Knights will just kick grotesques over, no problem. And in return, they don't really take any damage. On top of that, Talos are strength and toughness 7. So they wound knights on 5s, get wounded by knights on 3s, and they don't do enough damage, in my opinion, to a knight to warrant being on the table against knights at all. And then, like you said, blasters are only strength 8. And yes, they have amazing AP, but knights have 4-up invuls most of the time when you're shooting them. And shooting is not, we've gone over this, not effective against knights. It's a way of slowly chipping at them, but it's not a way that you're just going to remove a knight a turn unless that's what your list is built to do. Like if you're a Tau player and that's all you have.
Which,
yes, you'll
spoiler
remove
alert,
that
that's
knight.
what I'm switching to.
Oh, well, why don't you tell us why it is that you're switching to Tau and how Tau will be able to deal with knights, for those who aren't familiar.
They, well, they're very good at picking one. They're very good at doing what my old Drukhari army used to do, which is you pick one unit and you delete it off the board in that turn. And the reason being is because they can put all of their, they can get marker lights on it, so they can get their 5 marker lights on one knight. Now they get their +1 to hit. And then you activate your, I always forget the names, but the one that allows you to like re-roll your hits or whatever.
Kion?
Yeah, that one. And then you just basically shoot into it. You roll, at first, you roll your wound rolls one at a time and make them take their saves one at a time. And then as soon as they a wound gets through, you activate the Tau stratagem for +1 to wound. So now even your fire warriors are wounding a knight on a 4. Because the fire warriors' guns are strength 5. So when you're shooting at the knight, you're hitting on 3s now because of the marker lights. And then on top of that, you're wounding the knight on 4s. So it's like Space Marines shooting at other Space Marines, except you're shooting a knight. And then on top of that, you have like your Riptides. You can put some Hammerheads in the back with a Long Strike who have really good guns that are decent at killing them. Again, if they roll amazing with their saves, then it's kind of eh. But combined with the Fire Warriors, combined with everything else, you can get enough chip damage in there that their 4-up invul almost doesn't really matter, or even their 3-up save, and you could theoretically kill a knight a turn with that. That's why
makes a lot of sense.
That's why I think the Tau is really good against the knights, because that, like I said, they're going to pick one unit on the board and delete that unit because of the marker lights plus the Tau stratagem. And then that's what my old list used to do. I used to doom and jinx something and it would die that turn, whether it was a blob of 30 boys or a knight. But now without doom and jinx, the Drukhari can't do that anymore. So,
and I agree that if you were going to pick an army that would give knights a lot of trouble, it would be Tau.
Yep.
They have enough tools to screen the knight's movement still.
Yep.
They can fall back from combat and still shoot.
And then also the super Overwatch. They want to get in.
Super Overwatch against a lone knight is super powerful, because if there's only one knight that's going to make it to you that turn, you Overwatch with everything. And if you're Tau Empire on a 5+, and maybe you even have some bonuses from some characters in there somehow.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like Overwatch with marker lights first, and then go to town.
And then get your ones, yeah.
I fully support your decision to go Tau. I think you will have far fewer problems with knights doing so. Mm-hmm. But for anyone who's like, but I love my Drukhari and I'll always play Drukhari, I'm trying to stress there are still options.
Yes.
And Ynnari characters like the Incarn, I'm still terrified of the Incarn. When I played Sean Naden, he was so good at using the Incarn with the old Ynnari rules. I'm kind of curious to see how it's played with the new Ynnari rules. And I know Daniel Olivas, who I played recently at Bayo, did very well at his latest tournament in Las Vegas, the Gentleman GT, and he had a Ynnari detachment there. So I still think Ynnari is showing up now and then, and it's a nice option, but it's no longer the over-centralizing auto take if you're playing Eldari. But it might be a way to unlock the tools you need to deal with knights, because again, knights die when you punch them really hard in melee, and Drukhari really don't have anything that punches a knight to death. Well, no, not efficiently.
Not efficiently.
You definitely had the right idea, though. The army archetype that will hard counter knights fairly straightforwardly in the shooting phase is anything that has my army gets better at shooting this one thing.
Yes.
So Cadians have overlapping fields of fire. Yep. Tau have for the greater good or something like that. They're 2 or 3 CP for their ability?
3 command points for the Tau one.
Yeah, I remember it being expensive, but it's Tau. It's very good.
Yes.
And on top of that, you can do things like the Purge trait, which is if you're wounded this turn, all the Purge reroll to hit against you, which is very solid when you open up with one unit and then the other 90% of your army rerolls to hit against the one knight. Can very easily delete a knight. Gene Stealer Cult definitely have the tools to do it, because if you throw enough buffs on a unit of Acolytes or Aberrants, it doesn't really matter what they're swinging against, it'll go away. And Chaos has other tools as well, like the Monster Mash characters we mentioned, like Mortarion, like Magnus, and
or even
both of
just
those
like,
characters.
Jim Vessel's list does pretty well against knights. Not necessarily because he can kill knights, but he can outboard control them pretty easily and stuff like that.
That's actually another approach you can do, is make your Plague Bearers as tough as possible, and then prevent the knights from getting to the stuff that's hurting them, because the Plague Bearers exist. And that's a very valid strategy. So you don't need to be an alpha strike. You don't need to always think, how am I going to kill these knights quickly enough? You can just think, how can I absorb 3 knights of damage every turn and not really care? And Plague Bearers are a very solid choice for that, because their minus to hit also applies in melee, which is unusual in 40k. So it's very difficult to get rid of them. They have very few weaknesses.
And then you can make them if you go first, you can make your Plague Bearers -2 to hit.
Yes, at least the first squad.
Yeah.
Well, if you have more than one.
Yeah, but that's why I liked the idea of what Jim Vessel does in some matchups. If you know, like, say, because the ITC has the half and half deployment now, right? So like odd numbers are the old style, even numbers are the new style, where I deploy my whole army, you deploy yours, and I auto go first unless you seize. If you know that you're auto going first, you can deploy 1 unit of Plague Bearers as your screen, put the other one in Deep Strike, and then just hope to God that they don't seize the initiative on you. And then buff up that 1 Plague Bearer squad, and if they want to shoot at something, they have to shoot at the unit that's -2.
It depends. You can also start them both on the board, but keep one of them very defensively tucked away.
Yeah, like
so
hide
it's
them
out of line of sight.
or something. Yep.
And the front squad is spread over the whole front of your deployment zone, and is the only thing that your opponent can actually shoot in the shooting phase, but it's at a 4-up invul -2 to be shot.
Yep.
Or charged. That's very strong.
Yep. And then with their disgustingly resilient in there as well, that also helps out. That was other army between Tau and Chaos. I was debating between those two, but the Tau fits my playstyle better because I love shooting. That's why when I play Dark Eldar, it's mainly all Cabalites with Venoms and the Ravagers and stuff. I like shooting armies.
But at least with Drukhari, you do have some melee options.
Yeah,
in Covens,
like the witches and then Covens too. But with the cults, witches are all right, and then you also have like your Archons are pretty decent in close combat. Not against like big targets like knights, but they're decent at killing regular characters and stuff. So you haven't considered using knights at all in your current list?
I definitely did. Trust me. I have some Excel spreadsheets with Knight Crusader, Knight Valiant, Knight like whatever you want in this list, like Warden. Yeah, that was it. The Warden is the one that was interesting to consider. So I've done all of the math on knights, and it basically comes down to, do you expect people to be able to focus fire something efficiently? Do you expect them to be able to punch through your front lines and get to the back line and do really well? And honestly, I feel like it's really balanced. Like, you can take my army, remove 1 or 2 of the tank commanders and some other stuff, and fit a Crusader in it. And honestly, at that point, I consider dropping the Bulgrins and turning the Bulgrins into a Crusader, plus some other stuff. And you're basically trading some midfield presence, because that's what Bulgrins are good at, for a lot more shooting and the ability to kick over soft targets that get close to you. So one of the big things that guards struggle with is when things tie them up in melee, they can't shoot anymore. But a Crusader doesn't care about that. So a Crusader can be in front of your fire support elements and get tied up in melee and not care and just stomp things. And then it can fall back from combat and still shoot and charge. So a Crusader is a great midfielder for an otherwise ordinary guard list that doesn't want to take Bulgrins and wants to focus more on firepower. And it's a totally legitimate choice to do that. There's nothing bad about it, but it's not my style per se. I really prefer the Bulgrins because I think that there's too many times where no matter what I'm bringing, I'm going to get outshot. And it's nice to have this one unit that is just going to go to the middle of the board and hold an objective. But that's more of my play style than I'm going to try and out punch you with the shooting phase. And I also have this midfielder who can deal with stuff that gets close to it reasonably well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would be totally legitimate to take a guard army with a Crusader ally at this point.
Why don't you do it? Just play style?
Play style.
Okay. So what was it about? So is the only reason you brought the Castellan when you played at the LVO just because of how good it was, and there was really no other option at that point? Yeah.
Yep. The Crusader, or the Castellan rather, was over centralizing. The Crusader is good, but it's not great at everything, and it does have weaknesses. So for example, a tank commander shoots better than a Crusader against a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
But the Crusader is a 4-up invul, and the Crusader can fall back and charge and shoot. So it's really, you're trading off one thing for something else, and it doesn't feel like you're getting something for nothing. You're just making a cost-benefit decision.
So to summarize it then, what you're trying to say is that Knights don't feel like an auto-include, whereas a while ago, a Castellan was an auto-include.
Absolutely.
Okay.
A Castellan was so much of an auto-include that you would build your army to power it up for as long as possible. And your entire strategy was based around keeping the Knight alive and powered with command points.
Yep. Whereas now, Knights don't necessarily need to be, like, you still power them up, don't get me wrong, but it's not the exact same playstyle, and it's more of you can still do stuff with your other army as well now. Instead of just bringing the Castellan, and basically that's your list, is the Castellan and friends.
Yeah, like it's totally okay to take the artillery formation with your Imperial Knights and double shoot a Wyvern a couple turns.
Yep.
Like you have the command points to spare if you build your list right. So it gives you some more flexibility instead of every turn I'm going to use the same 3 command points every turn for as long as I possibly can.
Yeah. Fair enough. So you think Knights are in a very good place right now then, and there's nothing you would do to change them?
Honestly, there's plenty of other codexes I would address before I would address Knights. That's how I'll put it. And at this point, I think Knights are 90 to 95% of the way to being like just right.
Yeah, I would agree. I said that in my last top 10 too. I think they're strong, and a good way I put it is I think they're noob stompers. And that's why there's a chunk of the community that don't like Knights in the game, because I think Knights are like I just said, they're noob stompers. They beat players that don't know how to prepare for them very easily.
Yep. But if you know that Knights exist and you plan ahead and you have a primary plan and preferably a secondary plan as well when things go wrong, for how you're going to deal with Knights, like think of my Bograns. Bograns on paper are just awful against Knights. They're strength 7, AP 1, 2 damage. Knights are 3-up armor, T8. What do they care?
Yeah.
But if you throw the old Grudges Warlord trait in there, at least one of the Knights, the Bograns can go punch a little bit. Yeah. And they're not going to efficiently do it, but they're a good backup. So you can build your list that way too. You can take units that are suboptimal and find ways to tweak how you use them in your list so that they're not super optimal against Knights, but in an emergency, they can get the job done.
Makes sense. That's a good way to put it. So with all that said, then, you have any closing thoughts for the video?
I don't think that Knights are overpowered. I think they're really fun to play. I think that they're definitely a gatekeeper army that isn't closing out the top tables right now. And I think they're pretty much exactly where a 40k army in 8th should be.
I agree with that for the most part. The one thing I would say too is the people that think the Knights are overpowered, play them yourself, and you'll see that they're not as overpowered as you think, and they still can die. They can still have things go wrong for them. And like I said earlier, I kind of almost want to retract my statement saying that they're easier to play. They're easier in the sense that, again, you get more time to think about what you're doing because you have less models to work with. But at the same time, it's harder in a way because you have less models to work with. So like how Brandon said earlier, if you lose one of your 3 Knights, your list just took a huge hit. So if you make a big enough mistake in deployment turn 1 and they get one of your knights gets shot to death before you even get to use it, you're going to be playing that whole game on the back foot essentially.
Yep.
So,
and a lot of armies like Tau, they're going to delete one knight a turn very reliably.
Exactly. So knights do have good matchups, but they also have bad matchups. But pretty much every army in the game is like that for the most part. All right, well, I guess that should be it for this video then. I hope you guys enjoyed the talk between me and Brandon. I enjoyed it. I'll try to get him back on the channel again sometime, because you guys did request we get Brandon back on here. So, yeah, we'll get him back on in the future again, talk about some other topics. So, thanks to everyone who watched. I hope you guys learned something from the video, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy wargaming.